Douglas Smith stood on the balcony of his luxurious waterfront home, staring out over the bay in Clearwater, Florida. The peaceful ripples of the water reflected the calm appearance of the 45-year-old African-American man, but inside, he was far from serene. His life had taken a turn he had never anticipated, one that filled him with a strange combination of thrill and dread. Douglas had built a reputable name in the community, not only as a successful businessman, but also as a man with a heart for charity. His logistics company, Smith & Sons, had been a cornerstone of the local economy for nearly 2 decades, providing employment to hundreds and contributing to numerous charitable causes. He had it all: a prosperous business, a stunning home, and a beautiful wife, Rebecca, who the community adored. Yet despite this outward success, Douglas's personal life was in turmoil. His marriage to Rebecca had become a facade. While they appeared together at community events, dinners, and fundraisers, the truth was that they had been drifting apart for years. Rebecca, 38, was often away on trips with friends, enjoying her own independent life. Douglas didn't mind the separation. In fact, he had begun to crave these moments of solitude, or at least what he used to think was solitude. Rebecca's son from a previous relationship, Jason Clark, had entered his life when he was just 14, and Douglas had raised him as his own. Jason was now 24, a tall, pale-skinned young man who had recently returned to Clearwater after finishing college in another state. His return home had been both a relief and a curse for Douglas. The time they had spent apart during Jason's college years had given Douglas a reprieve from feelings he had tried hard to suppress. At first, Douglas had felt pride in raising Jason, watching him grow into a handsome, intelligent young man. He had paid for Jason's education, covered his expenses, and had made sure he wanted for nothing. But after Jason's return, the dynamic had shifted. Something within Douglas began to change, a dark realization that his concern for Jason had evolved into something much more complicated. Something that went beyond the boundaries of a father-son relationship. Douglas's descent into this dangerous territory was gradual, almost imperceptible to those around him. At community events, no one could see the cracks forming beneath his polished exterior. To them, Douglas Smith was still the respectable businessman, the charitable benefactor, and the doting stepfather. But Douglas knew better. His late-night thoughts were consumed with Jason, an obsession that had grown over the years. When Rebecca was away, Douglas would find excuses to spend time with his stepson, offering to help him with finances, suggesting trips, or simply sitting with him for long conversations. These moments, which started as seemingly innocent gestures of care, became filled with unspoken tension. Douglas began to shower Jason with expensive gifts, far beyond what was necessary or appropriate. He bought him a luxury car for his birthday, paid off his student loans without being asked, and even began transferring large sums of money into Jason's account. Jason, unaware of the true nature of Douglas's intentions, accepted these gestures with gratitude at first. After all, Douglas had always provided for him. But as time went on, Jason noticed the growing intensity of Douglas's attention, and it began to make him uncomfortable. Jason was no fool. He had grown up knowing that the world wasn't always kind or straightforward, especially when it came to relationships between men. Clearwater might have been a picturesque town, but like any small community, its members loved to gossip. Jason had spent his college years exploring his own identity and was more than aware of the complications that came with blurred lines in relationships. He had never seen Douglas in a romantic light, and the idea repulsed him. But now, back at home, he couldn't shake the feeling that his stepfather's affection was turning into something darker. It started with small things, lingering glances, a touch on the arm that lasted a little too long, or a compliment that felt too intimate. At first, Jason dismissed these moments as awkwardness. Douglas had never been a warm physical person, so perhaps he was just trying to show affection in a way he wasn't used to. But soon it became clear that these were not just innocent gestures. Douglas began to make excuses for them to be alone together more often. Rebecca's frequent absences gave Douglas the perfect opportunity to intensify his efforts. Douglas had always been a man of control in both his business and personal life. When something didn't go the way he wanted, he would find a way to manipulate the situation to his favor. With Jason, it was no different. The more Jason pulled away, the more Douglas pushed. He used his financial support as leverage, reminding Jason of everything he had done for him: the tuition payments, the car, the loans, even the roof over his head. Douglas made it clear, though never explicitly stated, that Jason's future depended on his continued compliance with the relationship. Jason felt trapped. He knew that rejecting Douglas outright could lead to disastrous consequences. He couldn't afford to lose the financial stability that Douglas provided, but he also couldn't continue to endure the increasingly uncomfortable advances. The psychological toll was beginning to weigh on him, and it was becoming harder and harder to keep up appearances. Jason's friends from college had started to notice his strange behavior. He had grown quieter, more isolated, and refused to discuss his home life. One night, after another tense dinner with Douglas, Jason sat alone in his room, staring at his phone. He knew he had to get out, but where would he go? What could he do? Clearwater was a small town, and rumors spread fast. If he tried to leave, people would ask questions. Douglas, with all his influence and wealth, could easily ruin Jason's life if he wanted to. The thought of confronting his stepfather terrified him. Douglas was powerful, not just in his business, but in the way he commanded control over every situation. How could Jason, a young man with limited options, stand up to him? As Jason lay in bed that night, the gravity of his situation began to suffocate him. He felt trapped in a web of manipulation and control, and he saw no way out. His stepfather had transformed from a protector into something far more dangerous. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that his life was spiraling out of control, and the worst part was that no one knew. To the outside world, they were still the perfect family. No one saw the storm brewing beneath the surface, least of all Rebecca, who remained blissfully unaware of the darkness that had taken hold of her husband. But Jason knew it couldn't last forever. Something had to give, and deep down, he feared what would happen when it did. The weeks following that night became a living nightmare for Jason. Each day was a tightrope walk between maintaining a facade and managing the suffocating reality of his home life. Douglas's obsession with him grew, and with it, the pressure. Jason felt like a prisoner in his own home, his every move scrutinized, his every action interpreted through the lens of his stepfather's desire to control him. The once familiar home, with its sprawling yard and waterfront views, now felt more like a gilded cage. Douglas's manipulation became more overt as time passed. He began asking Jason to join him on business trips, excursions that should have been professional, but soon took on a personal and sinister undertone. Jason had little choice but to agree. Refusal wasn't an option, not when Douglas wielded so much power over his life. The trip started small: an overnight stay in Tampa for a logistics conference, a visit to meet a client in Miami. But during these trips, Douglas's behavior became increasingly bold. He would book a single suite, forcing Jason to share a space that blurred the lines of their relationship further. One such trip to Miami was etched in Jason's mind as the moment everything changed. The suite was luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an uninterrupted view of the ocean. But Jason barely noticed the beauty of the setting. His focus was on Douglas, whose behavior had shifted from subtle control to outright possession. During a late dinner in the hotel, Douglas revealed just how deep his obsession ran. "Jason, I've given you everything," Douglas said, his voice low but intense as they sat across from each other at a dimly lit table. "All I ask is for loyalty. I've taken care of you like my own, and I will continue to do so. But you need to understand something. You belong to me now. There's no escaping that." Jason froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The words hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on him, suffocating him. It was as if Douglas had finally voiced the unspoken contract he'd been enforcing for years. The young man felt his stomach churn, but he forced himself to stay calm, not daring to provoke Douglas. Any sign of defiance could push his stepfather further, and Jason wasn't ready to face what might happen if Douglas felt rejected. The ride back to the hotel suite that night was silent, but the tension was palpable. Douglas walked ahead, confidently leading the way as if everything was still under his control. Jason, trailing behind, felt the walls closing in on him. His mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. but he found none. When they reached the suite, Douglas poured himself a drink and gestured for Jason to sit on the couch. The air was heavy with unspoken intentions, and Jason knew he had to tread carefully. "You're a smart kid, Jason," Douglas began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You know what's at stake here. You've got a bright future ahead of you, but only if you stay close to me. I can make sure your life stays comfortable, or I can ruin everything. It's your choice." The threat was veiled, but Jason knew exactly what Douglas was implying. It was a warning, a reminder that his stepfather held all the cards. Jason's financial future, his career, even his reputation, all of it was in Douglas's hands. And if Jason didn't comply, the consequences would be devastating. The young man sat in silence, feeling the weight of his situation crush him. There was no one he could turn to, no way to escape without bringing everything crashing down. As the days passed, the tension between them only grew. Jason tried to avoid being alone with Douglas as much as possible, but his stepfather was persistent. He would wait for Rebecca to leave the house for one of her frequent trips, and then corner Jason, pulling him into long conversations that left Jason feeling more trapped than ever. Douglas's obsession was like a smoldering fire, slowly consuming everything in its path. Jason's mental state began to deteriorate. He barely left the house, cutting off contact with his college friends and spending most of his time in his room. He felt isolated, suffocated by the constant presence of his stepfather. His once vibrant life had withered away, replaced by fear and uncertainty. He knew he had to leave Clearwater, but he had no plan and no money of his own. Douglas had ensured that. One afternoon, while Rebecca was out shopping, Douglas confronted Jason in the kitchen. It had been weeks since their trip to Miami, but the dynamic between them had only worsened. Jason was preparing a simple meal, trying to focus on something other than the nightmare his life had become, when Douglas entered the room. He moved closer, standing too close for comfort. "You've been avoiding me, Jason," Douglas said, his voice calm but laced with accusation. "That's not how this works. I thought we understood each other." Jason gripped the countertop, his knuckles turning white. He couldn't keep up the act anymore. The pressure was too much. The constant manipulation, the threats, the suffocating control. It was all building to a breaking point. Jason turned to face his stepfather, his face pale, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I don't want this," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore, Douglas." The older man's expression darkened. For a moment there was silence between them, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Douglas stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You don't get to decide that," Douglas said. "You're not leaving. You're mine, Jason. I've invested too much in you to just let you walk away." Jason's heart raced. He felt cornered, trapped like an animal with no escape. He had never seen Douglas like this before. So cold, so possessive. The man who had once been a father figure now loomed over him like a predator. Jason knew that there was no reasoning with him. Douglas wasn't going to let him go, not without a fight. That night, as Jason lay in bed, he realized that he couldn't stay in Clearwater any longer. The situation had escalated to a point where he no longer felt safe in his own home. Douglas's control over him had grown too strong, and Jason knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, he would lose himself completely. But leaving wouldn't be easy. Douglas had made sure that Jason was financially dependent on him, and the thought of confronting his stepfather terrified him. What if Douglas followed through on his threats? What if he exposed their relationship to the world? Jason's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. As he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, Jason made a decision. He couldn't confront Douglas head-on, not yet, but he could start planning his escape. Slowly, carefully, he would begin to distance himself, gathering what little resources he had and finding a way out of Clearwater without arousing suspicion. It would take time, but it was the only option he had left. For the first time in weeks, Jason felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. And as he drifted off to sleep, he clung to that hope, praying that it would be enough to get him through the nightmare his life had become. Jason awoke the next morning with a sense of dread that had become all too familiar. His nights were restless, his days consumed by the fear of what his future held. The previous night's decision to begin planning his escape offered little comfort as the harsh reality of his situation settled in. He felt trapped, not just by the physical walls of the house, but by the looming shadow of Douglas's control. Douglas, as usual, was already gone by the time Jason ventured downstairs. His stepfather had been leaving earlier and earlier each morning, consumed with his business dealings and personal matters that Jason could only guess at. The time apart from Douglas provided a brief respite, but the weight of what was to come hung over Jason like a storm cloud. He had to act carefully. One wrong move could send Douglas into a spiral, and Jason feared the consequences of triggering his stepfather's anger. Days passed, and Jason began to quietly gather the resources he would need to escape. He transferred small amounts of money from his own account to a separate one he had opened under a different name, a precaution he hoped would go unnoticed. Douglas had long since taken over managing his finances, another way of ensuring Jason remained dependent on him. But Jason had learned enough over the years to manage small transactions without raising suspicion. Each time he made a withdrawal, it felt like a tiny victory, one step closer to freedom. But escaping wasn't just about the money. Jason also needed a place to go. Clearwater, with its small-town familiarity and close-knit community, was not an easy place to disappear from. Everyone knew everyone's business, and rumors spread quickly. If Jason left abruptly, questions would be asked. He couldn't afford to be tracked down by Douglas or anyone else. The more he thought about it, the more daunting the task seemed. He was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was attempting. The turning point came one Friday evening when Rebecca was once again out of town. Jason had spent the entire day avoiding Douglas, staying in his room with the door locked. But as night fell, his stepfather knocked on the door, and Jason knew he couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. "Jason, I need to talk to you." Douglas's voice came through the door. There was a calmness to it that unnerved Jason. It was the calm before the storm, and Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Jason stood from the bed, his heart pounding in his chest as he opened the door. Douglas stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable. He motioned for Jason to come downstairs, and despite every instinct telling him to run, Jason followed. They sat in the living room, the dim light from the lamps casting long shadows across the room. Douglas poured himself a drink, his movements slow and deliberate. Jason sat stiffly on the couch, his hands clenched into fists as he waited for Douglas to speak. "You've been distant," Douglas finally said, his voice low. He didn't look at Jason as he swirled the liquid in his glass. "I don't like it when you pull away from me, Jason. We've talked about this." Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't know what to say, how to respond without provoking Douglas. He felt cornered, like a rabbit caught in a snare. "I'm not pulling away," Jason lied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Douglas turned to look at him, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me," he said sharply. "I've given you everything. You owe me, Jason. You wouldn't be where you are without me." Jason felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced it down. He had to stay calm. He couldn't let Douglas get under his skin, no matter how hard he pushed. "I know," Jason said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'm grateful for everything you've done. I need some space." "Space," Douglas repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You think you're in a position to ask for space after everything I've done for you?" Jason looked away, his hands trembling. He could feel Douglas's eyes boring into him, the weight of his stepfather's expectations suffocating him. He had to get out. He couldn't keep living like this. "You don't understand," Jason said, his voice shaking now. "I can't do this anymore, Douglas. I can't keep pretending like everything is normal." Douglas's face twisted into a sneer. He stood up, his drink forgotten on the coffee table as he loomed over Jason. "You think you can just walk away?" Douglas's voice rose, sharp and menacing. "You think you can just leave after everything I've given you? You're mine, Jason. I've made sure of that." Jason stood up, his back pressed against the couch as Douglas moved closer. His heart was racing, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He had never seen Douglas like this, so unhinged, so furious. "I'm done, Douglas. Jason said, his voice rising despite the fear gripping him. "I'm leaving." Douglas's hand shot out, grabbing Jason's arm in a vice-like grip. Jason gasped, trying to pull away, but Douglas held him firmly, his face inches from Jason's. "You're not going anywhere," Douglas hissed. "If you try to leave, I will ruin you. I will tell everyone what you are, what we've done. You'll be finished." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, fear coursing through him. He knew Douglas wasn't bluffing. His stepfather had the power to destroy his life, and Jason had no doubt that he would follow through on his threats. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension between them so thick it was suffocating. Jason's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was none. He was trapped, completely at Douglas's mercy. But something inside Jason snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. The years of manipulation, the control, the threats. It was too much. His fear turned to anger, and in that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. Without thinking, Jason shoved Douglas away from him, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Douglas stumbled back, surprised by the sudden force. For a brief moment, Jason felt a surge of power, a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. But it was short-lived. Douglas's face twisted in rage. He lunged at Jason, his hands outstretched, but Jason was quicker. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight from the coffee table, and swung it wildly. The sound of glass shattering against Douglas's head echoed through the room, followed by the sickening thud of his stepfather collapsing to the floor. Jason stood frozen, the paperweight still in his hand, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Blood pooled around Douglas's head, the dark red staining the cream-colored carpet beneath him. The room was eerily silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Jason dropped the paperweight, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, unable to process what had just happened. Douglas was dead. He had killed him. For what felt like an eternity, Jason stood there, staring at the lifeless body of his stepfather. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flooding his consciousness, but none of them made sense. He had to leave. He had to get out of there before someone found out. In a daze, Jason grabbed his car keys from the counter and bolted out of the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. Clearwater was no longer safe. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The adrenaline that had propelled Jason out of the house began to fade as he sped down the coastal road, his mind a chaotic mess. The night sky was black, with only the occasional streetlight illuminating his path. He had no destination, no plan, only the overwhelming need to escape. The sound of tires on asphalt was drowned out by the pounding of his heart, which echoed in his ears like a relentless drum. He couldn't get the image out of his mind. Douglas's lifeless body, the pool of blood slowly spreading across the floor, the stunned look that had crossed his stepfather's face in the final moments. Jason had killed him. There was no denying that, but it didn't feel real. It was as though he were living someone else's nightmare, watching the events unfold from a distance. As the minutes passed, Jason's hands began to tremble on the steering wheel. Panic was creeping in, wrapping itself around him like a suffocating fog. He couldn't think straight. What was he supposed to do now? He had fled the scene, but what came next? Surely someone would find Douglas soon. Rebecca would return from her trip, or maybe a neighbor would hear something. It was only a matter of time before the police were called. They would investigate, and they would find out. Jason's mind raced through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. He thought about turning himself in. For a brief moment, he considered driving straight to the police station and confessing everything. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they would see that he had been pushed to the brink, manipulated and controlled for years. Maybe they would believe it had been self-defense, that he had no choice. But deep down, Jason knew the truth. No one would see him as a victim. To the world, Douglas had been a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. Jason had always been the quiet stepson, the one who had benefited from Douglas's generosity. If the truth about their relationship ever came out, it wouldn't be Douglas who was blamed. It would be Jason. He would be painted as the one who had led Douglas astray, who had exploited his stepfather's kindness. They would never believe what had really happened. The headlights of an oncoming car snapped Jason out of his thoughts. He realized he had been driving aimlessly for over an hour, the familiar streets of Clearwater long behind him. He was heading into the outskirts of the city now, where the roads were narrower and the houses farther apart. For a fleeting moment, he thought about simply driving until he couldn't anymore, disappearing into the night and leaving everything behind. But he knew that wasn't possible. He didn't have the resources to survive on the run, and even if he did, he couldn't live with the guilt. Jason's phone buzzed from the passenger seat, startling him. He glanced over, seeing Rebecca's name flashing on the screen. His stomach dropped. Of course she would be calling. She must have returned home by now. What would she think when she found the house in chaos, Douglas missing and Jason gone? Jason let the phone ring until it fell silent. He couldn't face her, not now. As if on autopilot, Jason turned off the main road and pulled into a secluded parking lot near a public beach. The place was deserted, the ocean waves crashing quietly in the distance. He turned off the engine and sat in the car, staring blankly at the dashboard. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He needed to think, to figure out his next move. His mind raced through 100 different scenarios, but each one ended the same way, with him in handcuffs. There was no escaping what he had done. The evidence was back at the house in plain view. His fingerprints were on the paperweight, and his DNA was all over the scene. There would be no covering this up. For the first time since the confrontation, Jason allowed himself to cry. The sobs came suddenly and violently, shaking his entire body. Years of fear, frustration, and shame poured out of him in those moments, and he felt utterly alone. There was no one to turn to, no one who could understand the darkness he had lived in for so long. When the tears finally subsided, Jason wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt and stared out at the ocean. He needed to go back. He couldn't run forever, and the longer he stayed away, the more suspicious it would look. If he returned to the house, maybe there was still a chance he could explain what had happened. He could clean up the scene, make it look like an accident. But as the thought crossed his mind, Jason felt a wave of nausea. He had never been good at lying, and this was no small lie. The decision was made for him when his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Rebecca calling. It was an unknown number, but Jason knew exactly who it was. The police. They had already found Douglas's body. Someone must have alerted them. Maybe it had been a neighbor who had heard the argument, or maybe Rebecca had found her husband dead in their home. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the phone. He couldn't answer it. He couldn't handle what was about to come. Instead, he threw the phone onto the passenger seat, his mind racing. This was it. His time had run out. After what felt like an eternity, Jason started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. He couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. As he drove back towards Clearwater, the streetlights became fewer and the night grew darker. The road ahead felt like a path leading to his own doom, and yet there was no turning back. He had crossed the line, and now he had to face the consequences. By the time he reached the familiar street of his neighborhood, Jason's heart was hammering in his chest. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and ominous. His breath hitched as he saw the flashing lights of police cars parked outside. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, whispering to each other, their faces pale with shock and fear. The normally quiet, affluent street was now a crime scene, the once pristine home at the center of a nightmare. Jason parked the car a few houses down and sat in silence for a moment, his hands trembling. He could see two officers standing near the front door, speaking to each other in low voices. This was it. There was no going back now. He had to face what he had done, summoning every ounce of courage he had left. Jason stepped out of the car and began walking toward the house. The sound of his footsteps echoed in his ears, each one bringing him closer to the reality he had tried so desperately to escape. One of the officers noticed him and stepped forward, a look of recognition crossing his face. Jason's heart sank as the officer spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Jason Clark?" Jason nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "We need you to come with us," the officer said. "There's been an incident." Jason felt his legs weaken beneath him, but he forced himself to stand tall. There was no point in resisting. He knew this moment was inevitable from the second he had struck Douglas. The officer led him toward one of the police cars, and Jason climbed into the back seat, his hands shaking uncontrollably. As the car door closed behind him, the weight of his actions finally crushed him. There was no escape now. He was caught in the storm of his own making, and there was no telling where it would lead. The days following Jason's arrest were a blur. After the police escorted him from the scene, everything seemed to move in slow motion, processing at the station, questioning, and the cold, harsh reality that his life as he knew it was over. Jason was charged with second-degree murder, and the weight of that charge hung heavy over him as he sat alone in a holding cell, waiting for the next steps in the legal process. The news of Douglas Smith's death and Jason's subsequent arrest spread quickly through Clearwater. What had once been a quiet, respectable community was now the epicenter of a scandal so dark that people could hardly believe it was real. Neighbors who had once greeted the Smith family with smiles and waves now whispered behind closed doors, speculating on the gruesome details of what had transpired behind those walls. Jason's legal team moved swiftly, but the case was already making headlines. Local reporters latched onto every detail, from the successful businessman who had been murdered to the shocking revelation that his own stepson had been arrested for the crime. But what the public didn't know, what Jason had been too ashamed to admit, was the dark secret that had driven him to the breaking point. Jason's attorney, a seasoned defense lawyer named Daniel Harris, knew the case would be complicated. Harris had dealt with high-profile cases before, but none like this. The evidence against Jason was overwhelming. The police had found the murder weapon, a heavy glass paperweight, still at the scene, covered in Douglas's blood. Jason's fingerprints were all over it. And then there was Jason's own admission to being at the house during the altercation. The facts were undeniable. Jason had killed Douglas. The question now was why, and whether a jury would believe the truth. The day of the trial came faster than Jason had anticipated. He had spent weeks in a state of numbness, barely able to process what was happening. He hadn't spoken to anyone from the outside world, not even Rebecca. She had refused to visit him in jail, her grief too overwhelming to face him. Jason understood. How could he expect her to forgive him after what he had done? He had shattered her life, her family, and her heart. Even if the truth about Douglas came out, would it make any difference? To her, Jason had taken away the man she loved, and there was no undoing that. The courthouse was packed on the morning of the trial. Reporters lined the steps outside, cameras flashing as Jason was led into the building, his hands cuffed in front of him. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Spectators filled the gallery, some familiar faces from the neighborhood, others just curious onlookers drawn by the salacious nature of the case. Jason tried to block them all out as he sat at the defense table next to Harris, his mind focused on the trial ahead. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They painted Jason as a cold-blooded killer, a man who had acted out of greed and jealousy. The prosecutor, a sharp-tongued woman named Evelyn Monroe, described how Jason had benefited from Douglas's wealth and influence for years, only to betray him in the end. She emphasized the brutality of the attack, the viciousness with which Jason had struck his stepfather. Monroe made it clear that in her eyes, this was no act of self-defense, it was murder. The defense, however, had a different story to tell. Harris knew that to save Jason from a life sentence, they had to reveal the truth, no matter how dark or painful it might be. As the trial progressed, Harris carefully introduced the details of Jason's relationship with Douglas. It was a delicate task. One wrong move, and the jury might turn against them. But the time had come for Jason's side of the story to be heard. When Jason took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. The young man who had once been the quiet, unassuming stepson of a prominent businessman was now the key witness in his own defense. His hands trembled as he spoke, recounting the years of manipulation, the psychological control Douglas had exerted over him. He described the slow deterioration of their relationship, how what had once seemed like fatherly affection had warped into something far more sinister. "I didn't want any of this," Jason said, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I never asked for his money or his gifts. I just wanted to live my life. But Douglas, he wouldn't let me. He made sure I was dependent on him. And when I tried to pull away, he threatened to ruin everything. I felt like I had no choice." Harris pressed Jason gently. asking him to explain what had happened on the night of the murder. Jason recounted the events as clearly as he could: the argument, the fear, the moment when Douglas had grabbed him, and the blind panic that had followed. He described the terror he had felt when Douglas had threatened to expose their relationship, to destroy his life. "I didn't mean to kill him," Jason said, tears streaming down his face. "I just wanted him to stop. I wanted it to be over." The courtroom was quiet for a long moment after Jason's testimony. Even Monroe, the prosecutor, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The jury listened intently, their expressions unreadable. It was clear that Jason's story had struck a chord, but whether it would be enough to sway them remained to be seen. The trial continued for several more days, with witnesses called to testify about Douglas's character, his business dealings, and his relationship with Jason. Friends and colleagues described Douglas as a driven, sometimes controlling man, but no one could have predicted the dark secrets he had kept hidden. The defense also called a psychologist to testify, explaining the impact of prolonged manipulation and abuse on a young mind. The psychologist argued that Jason had been pushed to the brink, that years of emotional and psychological abuse had left him with no way out. When the trial finally came to a close, the jury deliberated for hours, their decision weighing heavily on them. Jason sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched tightly together, barely able to breathe as he waited for the verdict. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before reading the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant Jason Clark guilty of second-degree murder." Jason felt the world drop out from beneath him. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind, hollow and final. The sentence that followed felt like a blur. 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. Jason's mind couldn't process it. All he could think about was the life that had been destroyed, not just Douglas's, but his own. As he was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs, Jason caught a glimpse of Rebecca in the gallery. She was crying, her face pale and stricken with grief. She didn't look at him as he passed, and Jason realized that he had lost her forever. Whatever chance there had been for forgiveness was gone. The doors closed behind him, and Jason was left alone with the weight of his choices. The prison sentence loomed ahead, but in many ways, he had already been living in a prison long before Douglas's death. Now, the bars were just more literal. As the trial faded from the headlines, life in Clearwater slowly returned to normal. But for those who had been close to the Smith family, nothing would ever be the same. The house where it had all happened was sold, and the whispers about what had transpired continued long after the story had disappeared from the news. The dark secret that had shattered lives remained buried beneath the surface, a reminder of how easily control and manipulation could lead to tragedy. And for Jason, the years ahead would be filled with reflection, regret, and the hope that one day he might find a way to forgive himself for the life he had taken and the life he had lost.